The story of the Marshmallow Man. The Nathan family had just moved into a remote house nestled deep within the woods of Brookmont, Maryland. It was a beautiful old house, full of charm, but its isolation made the nearby forest feel darker than usual. The house sat at the edge of a mysterious, dense forest, and for Nathan, the 10-year-old son, it was both an exciting adventure and a source of dread. At first, Nathan loved the idea of exploring the wild woods around his new home. One afternoon, he wandered deeper into the forest and stumbled upon an old, dilapidated swinging bridge. It was like something out of an old fairy tale, yet it had a strange, unsettling vibe. The wood was rotting, and the ropes creaked as the wind blew, making it seem like the bridge was holding on to its last breath before collapsing. Despite feeling uneasy, Nathan crossed it anyway. But as soon as his foot stepped onto the bridge, he felt a sudden shiver crawl down his spine, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The air grew cold, and the sound of the creek below seemed to vanish. It was as if the world had gone silent. Something was wrong. After crossing the bridge, he shook off the strange feeling, blaming it on his imagination. But as he walked away, he couldn't help but glance back toward the bridge, feeling as though someone or something was watching him. That night, when Nathan went to bed, he thought the strange feeling would fade. But when he woke up, he found a small, damp note on his pillow. Written in faded pencil was a message. "Hello, Nathan. I am the Marshmallow Man. Don't worry. I won't hurt you." Nathan froze. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a joke, some prank from the local kids. But the handwriting was eerily neat, and the paper felt damp, as though it had been exposed to the moisture of the woods. The next day, Nathan explored the area near the bridge again, trying to put the note out of his mind. But when he returned home, there was another note, this time on the kitchen table. It read, "You can't leave. I'm waiting." Confused and frightened, Nathan started to feel a presence looming over him. Every night, the notes appeared, each one more cryptic and chilling than the last. One read, "I'm closer now. You'll see me soon." Nathan's curiosity began to shift into dread. He avoided the bridge and stayed close to home, but the eerie feeling never left. He started noticing small things. The air growing inexplicably colder in certain parts of the house, the lights flickering in strange patterns, and an odd noise from the woods at night. A sound like something was moving just beyond the tree line. It wasn't until one evening, after dinner, when Nathan's parents decided to take a walk, that things took a turn for the worse. Nathan, left alone in his room, heard a soft, gentle knocking at his window. He turned around to see a shadow moving just beyond the curtains. The silhouette was huge, and it looked like a person, but something was wrong. Its proportions were off, and its arms were too long, too thin. His heart raced as he approached the window cautiously. He parted the curtains just enough to see the figure standing there, looking back at him with glowing eyes. It was not human. The creature was enormous, covered in thick, white, marshmallow-like goo that oozed down its body. Its face was hidden, but its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, focusing on Nathan with an unnatural intensity. As he stared, frozen with fear, the creature moved closer to the window, its body seeming to stretch and distort as it did. The marshmallow-like mass dripped onto the ground, leaving a trail of sticky, white goo behind it. Nathan couldn't look away as the figure's twisted form reached out, its arms stretching impossibly long, knocking softly on the glass as if asking Nathan to let it in. Suddenly, the creature vanished, leaving Nathan standing alone in his room, shaking and breathless. But he knew it was still out there. The figure wasn't gone. It was waiting. The next day, Nathan found a final note in his room. "I'm always watching, Nathan. When the sun sets, I will come for you." Panicked, Nathan ran to his parents and told them everything. But they dismissed it, chalking it up to his imagination. They thought he was simply frightened by the strange new house and the woods that surrounded it. Nathan's father even laughed and said, "There's no such thing as a Marshmallow Man. You must have had a bad dream." That night, Nathan couldn't sleep. His parents were sound asleep downstairs, unaware of the growing terror that was closing in on their home. At exactly midnight, Nathan heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy scraping against the floorboards upstairs. His door creaked open, and to his horror, he saw the same glowing eyes peer through the crack. The creature had followed him inside. Nathan bolted out of bed and ran to his parents' room, screaming for them to wake up. But when they opened the door, no one was there. The house was eerily quiet again, but Nathan knew it was far from over. The creature was close. The notes, the chilling presence, it all pointed to one thing. The Marshmallow Man was real, and it had chosen him. In the following days, strange occurrences continued. The walls would groan and creak. Lights flickered without explanation, and at night, Nathan would hear faint whispers from the woods, voices that weren't human. The shadowy figure became more persistent, always watching, always waiting. One day, the family could no longer ignore the strange events. Terrified, they decided to leave the house. But when Nathan glanced back one last time, he saw the Marshmallow Man standing on the porch, staring at him with its glowing eyes. The figure's monstrous, gooey body was now more solid, more defined, as if it had become part of the house itself. As they drove away, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still there, lurking in the woods, its eyes following him, always watching. To this day, no one in Brookmont speaks of the Marshmallow Man, but they all know the truth. The creature is still out there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to cross its path. And when you see those glowing eyes in the darkness, it's already too late. The story of Luke's Treehouse. I'm a carpenter by trade, and I've spent most of my life building things that people need, a set of stairs here, a new door frame there. But when it came to building a treehouse for my son, Luke, I was determined to make it special. We had just moved to a quiet part of the countryside, surrounded by thick, dense woods. The silence was the kind of peaceful stillness you only get when you're far from the noise of the city. It was perfect. The treehouse was going to be something magical. I spent days planning it, measuring the tree that would hold it up, and gathering the materials. Luke was excited, of course, and every day after school, he would come outside and watch me work, his little face bright with anticipation. It wasn't long after the treehouse was finished that Luke began talking about his friend, Jake. At first, I thought it was just the usual childhood imagination. Kids tend to create imaginary friends when they're young. People they can talk to, share their thoughts with, and sometimes even rely on for comfort. I wasn't worried about it, but the way Luke spoke about Jake, it started to make me uneasy. Jake says he likes the treehouse, Dad. He said it's the best one we've ever made. Luke told me one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. That's nice, buddy, I said, not giving it much thought. The days went on, and Luke would talk more and more about Jake. He'd say things like, Jake doesn't like the dark, or Jake doesn't want me to go inside when the sun starts setting. I didn't think much of it, chalking it up to the fact that kids can get scared of the dark and create all sorts of reasons to explain their fear. But then, one day, something odd happened. I was working in the garden when Luke ran out of the house, his face pale and his breathing shallow. His eyes were wide with fear. What's wrong, Luke? I asked, rushing to him. He's gone, Luke whispered, his voice trembling. Who's gone, son? I asked, kneeling down to his level. Jake, he replied, eyes darting nervously over his shoulder. He told me I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to leave the treehouse, but I had to. I didn't want to, but he told me to. He said it wasn't safe. That's when I started to worry. I asked Luke if he'd seen Jake, but he clammed up. The cheerful boy I knew had turned into someone different. He wouldn't talk about Jake anymore, and the oddest part was, he wouldn't even look at the treehouse. The place that had once been a source of joy for him now seemed like a forbidden zone. One evening, my wife and I were sitting in the living room when we heard Luke's voice outside. At first, we thought he was playing, but when we went to check, we found him standing by the treehouse, staring up at it with wide, unblinking eyes. Luke, what are you doing out here? I asked, walking over to him. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the treehouse, like he was seeing something I couldn't. It was unsettling, like he wasn't even there anymore. Luke, I repeated, this time with more urgency. Finally, he turned to me, but his expression wasn't the same. His face was empty, almost blank. Jake told me to stay here. I have to wait for him. He says I'm not allowed to leave. I knelt down in front of him, trying to get his attention. What do you mean, son? There's no one here but us. He shook his head slowly. He's always here. He lives in the treehouse. A chill ran down my spine as I looked at the treehouse. There was no logical explanation for why Luke was acting like this, but something about his words felt wrong. So wrong, in fact, that I decided to visit the treehouse that night after he went to bed. I needed to see for myself. The night was dark, and the wind whispered through the trees. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the treehouse, determined to put my mind at ease. As I climbed the wooden ladder, something felt off. The air felt colder, thicker. The flashlight beam flickered as if it were struggling to illuminate the shadows. When I reached the top, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The treehouse was covered in strange symbols, carved into the wood like they'd been there for years, even though I'd just finished building it. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The symbols weren't anything I recognized. They were twisted, ancient, and disturbing. I turned to leave, but then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakable. "Luke!" I froze. The voice was childlike, but it wasn't Luke's. It sounded more like Jake. I rushed down from the treehouse, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation, but it didn't feel like a normal childhood fantasy. The sense of dread had been building, and now it was undeniable. The next morning, I asked Luke again about Jake. This time his response was different. "He's not real, Dad." I shouldn't have talked about him. He said it's too late. My wife and I decided to move. It wasn't an easy decision, but things had gotten too strange. Luke refused to step foot in the treehouse again, and the atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive. As we packed, I looked out one last time at the treehouse. The wind picked up, making the branches creak, and I thought I saw a figure standing there. No, in the treehouse, staring down at me. But when I blinked, it was gone. To this day, I don't know what happened to Luke or what he truly saw, but I'll never forget the look on his face that night, standing in the dark, waiting for someone who wasn't there. I sometimes hear whispers in the wind when I visit old friends who live nearby, whispers that sound almost like Luke's voice, calling out for Jake. The strange events of the bridge. It all started with something simple, a bridge built in the backyard of our family home. It wasn't a grand structure, just a small wooden bridge connecting two parts of the garden. The bridge stood at the end of our quiet street, close to the forest. It was meant to be a charming feature, something to add a sense of tranquility to our home. For a long time, everything was normal. Luke loved to run across the bridge, pretending it was a great adventure, just like any child. I could always see it from the window of our bedroom, nestled among the trees. It was peaceful, perfect, in fact. The kind of calm I had always dreamed of when we decided to move to this remote area. But then, things began to change. At first, it was subtle. I noticed the bridge out of the corner of my eye while lying in bed late at night. It seemed to shift slightly, the shadows under it growing longer than they should have been. I shrugged it off, just the angle of the light, I thought. But the feeling of unease started creeping in, like a faint echo that you couldn't shake. One evening, when the sun was setting and the world outside was bathed in a dim, golden glow, I looked out the window and noticed something strange. The bridge looked different. The shadows underneath it were no longer the same. They were deeper, darker, as if something or someone was standing beneath it, hidden in the darkness. I squinted, but the scene was still. Nothing moved. It wasn't until the next night that the real, unsettling events began. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. Soft, light steps like someone walking slowly across the bridge. My heart skipped a beat. Luke was in his bed, sound asleep, and my wife was beside me. I got out of bed, my feet cold against the hardwood floor, and made my way to the window. I saw him, a figure standing on the bridge. But it wasn't Luke. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The figure was tall, cloaked in a dark shadow, with no clear shape or form. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't move. The figure remained motionless, staring straight ahead, its presence chilling. Just as I was about to turn away, the figure disappeared. Like a mist, it simply faded into the night. I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I mentioned it to my wife, but she just shook it off, thinking I had been dreaming. But I knew what I saw, and over the next few days, things only grew stranger. Luke, my son, started acting differently. He wasn't the same carefree child. At first, I thought it was just a phase, but then he began talking about Jake again, his imaginary friend. This time, however, Jake wasn't the same friendly companion Luke had once described. The way Luke spoke about Jake was different, more distant, almost as though Jake was someone who controlled him. Jake told me not to go near the bridge, Luke said one afternoon, his voice unusually soft, almost fearful. He said the bridge is bad now. It's a secret place. I asked him what he meant by that, but he wouldn't answer. Instead, he would just stare at the bridge from the window, his eyes wide with fear. My heart sank. This wasn't just a child's imagination anymore. Something had changed. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it became. One day, I noticed Luke standing at the edge of the bridge, gazing out into the woods. It was early morning, and the fog had just started to lift. His back was to me, and I could see him murmuring something under his breath. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Slowly, I approached him, my steps hesitant. When I finally reached him, I asked, "Luke, what are you doing here? Come inside." He turned to me, his eyes wide, but his face was blank. "Jake told me to stay," he said, his voice low and monotone. "He said it's important. I have to wait for him." I was shaken. My son, my sweet, energetic boy, was standing there, looking more like a stranger than the child I knew. But I couldn't bring myself to take him away. There was something about the bridge that held him there, a pull that was stronger than anything I could understand. Despite my concerns, we kept the bridge. We couldn't bring ourselves to take it down, not without a clear reason. It felt like an odd mix of tradition and an odd attachment to a place that now seemed wrong. But as the days went on, things only grew worse. The strange feeling I had when I looked out the window became constant. And at night, I could hear faint whispers drifting through the window, too soft to make out, but chilling nonetheless. I thought maybe we were just overthinking it, that it was just the house settling, the wind, or our own fear taking hold. But then one night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, I wasn't going to ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The air was thick, the night silent except for the sound of my breath. I made my way to the bridge, my feet crunching on the dry grass. As I reached the bridge, I shined a light down its length. There was nothing there, but I could feel it. Something was watching me, waiting. I turned back, but just before I left, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The bridge, once a simple wooden structure, now had faint markings carved into its posts. Ancient symbols, shapes I couldn't recognize. They weren't there before, but now they seemed to pulse with an energy that made my skin crawl. I didn't tell my wife. I couldn't bring myself to. But after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever had been affecting Luke, wasn't done yet. The bridge had become more than just a simple structure in our yard. It had become a portal, a connection to something far darker. And as the days wore on, I couldn't help but